Hi folks. So I've been a fan of science fiction for 40 years, a little bit more even maybe, on and off over those years, but after focusing on exploring the genre more deeply this year, I conclude that my range has been rather narrow over that time. I didn't have a list of shame as such, a list of authors whose work I really should have read but hadn't. It was more like a list of ignorance, authors I didn't even know existed, never mind read any of their books. But anyway, here is a look at 10 classic science fiction authors that I've read for the first time this year. Robert Silverberg has been a real joy to discover this year. I was unfamiliar with him and his many works, and I've read two this year, A Time of Changes and Up the Line. Both, from what I understand, was his kind of purple patch, the zenith of his science fiction writing. My main impression of his writing is of a kind of lush, descriptive prose. He really captured my imagination as he kind of coloured the worlds in. In A Time of Changes, he conjured up, just in the first 5 or 10 pages, a really rich picture of the world, which was colonised thousands of years ago by humans. And I got a real sense of the society, the taboos that operate in that society, the wildlife, and the somewhat feudal nature of their society, as well as some insights into the main character. And in Up the Line, the main character is a time traveller, and in this book, Silverberg aimed his painterly touch at the historical settings that the protagonist visits, from Byzantium to ancient Rome, and again, really richly described full kind of interactions with people while he was there, and really evocative descriptions of the time. And very happily, I now have, after 9 months of buying far too many books, I have over 20 of his books now sitting on my shelves of various stripes. So I'll be making my way through those in the coming months and years. So next is Robert Heinlein. How have I managed to avoid Robert A. Heinlein for all of these years? I've only read 2 out of the big 3. So Asimov and Clarke, I read plenty of those when I was, in my teens and 20s. So I don't know why Heinlein sort of passed me by, but he did. I've got in excess of 30 of his books now on my shelves, but I have only read one so far, which was Starship Troopers. I decided to tackle this one partly because I'd heard of it, and also because I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Heinlein's kind of strong views about how badly the 20th century was going, and this was written in late 50s, early 60s, if I remember rightly. So that aside, I did very much enjoy the kind of classic boy joins the military story of signing up against the wishes of his parents, experiencing the joys of basic training and boot camp, bonding with his counterparts, first deployments, showing some leadership potential, and then ultimately earning the trust of his men, ultimately commanding them. And I also really enjoyed the role-changing story arc with his father, and the Heinlein's descriptions of the battles were futuristic, obviously, but they seemed pretty realistic to me, and they certainly were quite high energy and quite tense. So Kurt Vonnegut definitely belonged on my list of shame, not least because it was a shame I didn't enjoy it more. I chose Sirens of Titan to lose my Vonnegut virginity, and I'm afraid to say it was a rather disappointing book. I didn't get along with his kind of writing style, kind of smirky, absurdist tone, which I suppose I was meant to think was funny. And whilst there was a payoff of sorts at the end, by that stage I kind of lost interest. I did finish it, but it was like, eh. While there was a payoff of sorts at the end, I mainly found the entire plot to be pointless. No doubt there was an important message about the futility of life and the lack of control we experience over our lives on a daily basis. And it's fine to have layers of meaning, but for the love of God, give us a good story as well. I wasn't impressed. It has been suggested that I give either Cat's Cradle or Slaughterhouse-5 a try next, and I might enjoy those better, maybe. We'll see. After my experience with Sirens of Titan, I can't say I'm in a rush to try either of them, unfortunately. Samuel R. Delany is next on my list of shame. I read Babel 17 this year, and I liked it. It was interesting for having a female lead. There were polyamorous relationships, and even deceased characters, people that were dead, could continue to exist in some form. And there were some dead people on her crew. Babel 17 is a kind of crypto language used by the opposing side in a long-running war, and the female protagonist is a famous poet, and she has a particular skill at languages, and she's been sort of commandeered or co-opted to try to crack the code. And so she becomes adept at interpreting and eventually using Bubble 17. And it kind of has an effect on how her brain works and how she influences other people and events. That kind of aspect of it reminded me a little bit of Ted Chiang's short story, which became the movie Arrival. So I enjoyed my first outing with Samuel Delaney. I quite like to read Titan, I think is a well-known book by him, so that's probably next on my list for him at some point. So A. Van Vogt is another author whose many books grace my shelves. I don't know how many I've got, in excess of 20. And so this is the first one that I read. I read it fairly recently, so Voyage of the Space Beagle. And I was pleased to both enjoy it and to tick another classic author off my list of shame. So it's a fix-up of 4 short stories. It features kind of several different aliens, each more challenging than the last. There's quite a lot of death and mayhem, plus the crew engage in a kind of different kind of battle, one for influence and control of their scientific bureaucracy. I enjoyed the exploration and kind of gradual acceptance of the newfangled Nexialism scientific method. That became pretty influential by the end of the book. And talking of influential, this book is an influential book. It's allegedly inspired many others and eventually was acknowledged as a source for the plot of Alien, and some money changed hands after a court case. I think next by Van Vogt, I'd like to read Weapon Shops of Isha, or possibly Slan, or possibly War Against the Roll. I'm not sure which. If you have an opinion about which one I should read next, then let me know in the comments. Then kind of to go as like a pair with the A. Van Vogt book, I read Bob Shaw's Ship of Strangers. Again, another author, Bob Shaw, I hadn't heard of until this year when it crossed my path. And I chose this book because it's a clear homage to the Voyage of the Space Beagle. It has the same kind of episodic structure, involves the crew of a survey ship and the various situations that they get themselves into. I actually read this before I read the Voyage of the Space Beagle, so my reading of the influences was a little bit back to front, but still, it was a good read, and I really liked his writing. In fact, don't tell anyone, but I might have enjoyed Ship of Strangers a little bit more than Voyage of the Space Beagle. I'd like to read some of his short stories next, and then possibly Orbitsville or Other Days, Other Eyes, I think is meant to be very good as well. I've got both of those. Another author on my list of shame, or rather list of ignorance, because I'd never heard of her, was Octavia Butler. And I'm pleased to say that I have now read one of her books, Kindred, which was excellent. I really enjoyed it, thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a time travel tale. Most of the action takes place on a sort of antebellum slave plantation in the deep south. The protagonist is a black woman minding her own business in the 1970s, when she's suddenly very precipitously transported back in time. And she somehow, it becomes clear over the course of the book, she's called back somehow to save the life of the plantation owner's son, who's a child the first time she goes out there. And she's called upon to do this a number of times, spending longer in the past each time for various reasons. Kind of uncertain at first about what causes her to be returned to her 1970s timeline. Difficulties are presented by the fact that time moves at different speeds. So a day or two spent in the past on the slave plantation might be kind of weeks or months in 1970s timeline, which makes things difficult for her marriage to her husband. I really like Butler's writing. She didn't kind of shy away from showing the terrible conditions or treatment meted out to the slaves. It wasn't just that. She also showed the kind of mundane details of life and kind of love as a slave on a plantation, family, community, just the kind of everyday business of surviving and living as a slave. Of her books, I'd like to tackle Dawn next, which, if I remember rightly, is the first book of a trilogy. Would you believe that I'd never read Ursula Le Guin until this year? I started with the Earthsea books. This is a compendium of all 4, which is really fantasy, of course, rather than science fiction. And I enjoyed it up to a point. I felt like the books were aimed at a younger audience, which on its own isn't an issue. As such, I've read plenty of so-called young adult books in my time. I did like the world that she created. It's kind of set in a corner of a world which consists of many islands, different shapes and sizes. And the books mostly follow Ged, who over time becomes a powerful wizard. Le Guin, of course, she subverts the genre by making her characters kind of brown or dark-skinned and refusing to make her world a sort of pastiche of Middle Ages Europe. So many fantasy books do. Her more legitimately science fiction books, I want to read The Left Hand of Darkness next, or some of the other Hainish cycle books, I'm not sure which. Philip K. Dick was at least known to me before this year, so I can at least claim credit for that. I could probably even have told you 1 or 2 of the books that he wrote, but I still hadn't read any. I started with the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and then a month or two later went to Martian Timeslip. I didn't find much to like about them. I didn't dislike them as much as I disliked Sirens of Titan, but they didn't fully float my boat either. I was kind of left wondering, is this it? I'm not really sure what the fuss is about as far as Philip K. Dick is concerned. Obviously the books are of their time, and so the writing style kind of goes with that, and I expect I'm just missing something, or perhaps I'm too kind of simple-minded to understand it, or perhaps my taste just run to a less kind of arch plotline. There were things to admire. I did like a few of the ideas. We got in Three Stigmata, we got precogs and sort of immersive experiences, along with a kind of draft to shift population from overcrowded Earth to a life of drudgery on Mars. Although it was an interesting way to choose your colonists. And I expect I was supposed to contemplate the nature of reality and to wonder whether I might be living in a simulation of some sort, drug-fueled or otherwise, and to ponder whether I would know either way. Of the two books, I think I liked Martian Timeslip more. I thought it was interesting that Dick tackled neurodiversity, albeit in a sort of rather clunky kind of 1960s, rather unsympathetic fashion, but it was interesting that it was included at all. And again, I knew of E. Doc Smith, but became more focused on his work recently after doing some research on a video that was posted a month or two back, the space opera of the 1930s and 40s. I'm actually still midway through my first book, Galactic Patrol. I'm maybe 25% in. And I think the thing to remember when you're reading books like this is it was written getting on for 90 years ago. So the style is of its time, the gender roles are of their time, the kind of language is a bit clunky. Still, I think it contains some pretty advanced thinking, considering it was written in the 1930s about space battles, which no one could really have any concept because we hadn't even got a rocket up into the atmosphere yet, never mind into space. It does contain a lot of sort of borderline incomprehensible gobbledygook. Lots of things have sort of what look like hexadecimal kind of names with a string of characters and numbers, which are read out in all with all due seriousness as part of the communication pattern. But in general, so far, 25% is perfectly good kind of space opera adventure. The Boscone, the baddies of the piece, have developed an advanced drive for their spaceships, which the Galactic Patrol can't cope with their current ships. And Kimball Kinnison, the hero, must get the plans and bring them back to base. There's much fleeing about the galaxy that ensues after that, and some pretty gnarly battles. And as I kind of sit here where I am in the book at the moment, Kimball and his kind of Dutch Valerian guard are stranded on a planet and they're getting caught up in a local war. So those are my kind of list of shame wins for this year. How about you? Did you knock any previously unread authors off your list? Do let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to hear. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, bye for now.